Hello friend, welcome to the Zara quiz. Today we are going to play Would You Rather quiz. Make sure subscribe for more awesome quizzes like this. Let's go.
Would you rather Ant-Man becomes an engineer or Iron Man becomes an engineer? Would you rather Aquaman becomes an engineer or Jessica Jones becomes an engineer? Would you rather Batgirl becomes an engineer or Martian Manhunter becomes an engineer? Would you rather Batman becomes an engineer or Nightwing becomes an engineer? Would you rather Black Panther becomes an engineer or Ninja Turtle becomes an engineer? Would you rather Black Widow becomes an engineer or Punisher becomes an engineer? Would you rather Blue Beetle becomes an engineer or Scarlet Witch becomes an engineer? Would you rather Captain America becomes an engineer or Shazam becomes an engineer? Would you rather Captain Marvel becomes an engineer or She-Hulk becomes an engineer? Would you rather Daredevil becomes an engineer or Spider-Man becomes an engineer? Would you rather Deadpool becomes an engineer or Supergirl becomes an engineer? Would you rather Doctor Strange becomes an engineer or Superman becomes an engineer? Would you rather Ghost Rider becomes an engineer or Thanos becomes an engineer? Would you rather Green Lantern becomes an engineer or The Flash becomes an engineer? Would you rather Hawkeye becomes an engineer or The Vision becomes an engineer? Would you rather Hellboy becomes an engineer or Thor becomes an engineer? Would you rather Hulk becomes an engineer or Wolverine becomes an engineer? Would you rather Human Torch becomes an engineer or Wonder Woman becomes an engineer? Would you rather Iron Man becomes an engineer or Ant-Man becomes an engineer? Would you rather Jessica Jones becomes an engineer or Aquaman becomes an engineer? Would you rather Martian Manhunter becomes an engineer or Batgirl becomes an engineer? Would you rather Nightwing becomes an engineer or Batman becomes an engineer? Would you rather Ninja Turtle becomes an engineer or Black Panther becomes an engineer? Would you rather Punisher becomes an engineer or Black Widow becomes an engineer? Would you rather Scarlet Witch becomes an engineer or Blue Beetle becomes an engineer? Would you rather Shazam becomes an engineer or Captain America becomes an engineer? Would you rather She-Hulk becomes an engineer or Captain Marvel becomes an engineer? Would you rather Spider-Man becomes an engineer or Daredevil becomes an engineer? Would you rather Supergirl becomes an engineer or Deadpool becomes an engineer? Would you rather Superman becomes an engineer or Doctor Strange becomes an engineer? Would you rather Thanos becomes an engineer or Ghost Rider becomes an engineer? Would you rather The Flash becomes an engineer or Green Lantern becomes an engineer? Would you rather The Vision becomes an engineer or Hawkeye becomes an engineer? Would you rather Thor becomes an engineer or Hellboy becomes an engineer? Would you rather Wolverine becomes an engineer or Hulk becomes an engineer? Would you rather Wonder Woman becomes an engineer or Human Torch becomes an engineer?